Science. Mars. And some of the individuals because Mars work.
I forgot I lowered this.
Hey y'all, welcome in.
Turn this on.
Me from the back. That's all I got. Shit. And Mary said, okay, I was like, oh, you are. Like, somebody checking the picture. What's
Hey y'all, who's ready for a personal history through the queer 90s? I know I am. Let's give it up for My Bad, Hate Crime, and Women in Criminal Law. My name is Gabriel. I'm the events host here at the Bureau of General Services Queer Division, Manhattan's last queer bookstore. I also work at Hive Mind Books, which is a queer bookstore in Bushwick. If you ever want to come through, check it out. We also have cafes, you can like grab a coffee and like, chill and stuff and experience all the queer books that we have in there. I wanted to start with an acknowledgement that the Bureau does. We acknowledge that our organization operates on the unceded land of the Munsee Lenape. We encourage you to join the Bureau in signing up to make a monthly donation to the American Indian Community House, founded in 1969 and located here in Manhattan. Donating to the AICH is one way for settlers and non-Native people to acknowledge the legacy of theft and genocide that comprise the history of New York City and the United States. You can find out more at aich.org. The Bureau also recognizes Palestinian liberation as fundamental to our collective queer liberation, and we invite you to take our free zines by the register at Penny. So if you're looking for some, happy to give them away. They explain why we feel it is particularly important for queer people to speak out on behalf of Palestinian liberation. We are the Bureau of General Services Queer Division, located here inside of the LGBT Center. We are open 1 to 7 p.m. Wednesdays to Sundays, or on special events like tonight on a Tuesday evening. So thanks again for coming out and braving the 90-degree heat. If you want to be closer to the fan, there's an entire front row here. If you feel so obliged. Nevertheless, whatever phrase it is, I'm going to introduce our three speakers. A former federal prosecutor, Helena Beatty, is the McKinney Professor of Law at Indiana University, Bloomington Moore School of Law, and co-founder of the Indiana Innocence Project, the author of Manifesting Justice and Pink Crime, which is available in all bookstores everywhere, but more importantly, this one right here. Pink Crime, fighting against the criminalization of motherhood, pregnancy, and queer identity. She lives in Indiana. Give it up for Helena. Yes, directly behind me. I did not realize. Wow. I talk about looking over the shoulder. Tina Longo, she has served as the chief attorney of the criminal defense practice since 2014, where they are responsible for the daily operation of all the practice's trial, appellate, post-conviction, law reform, and parole defense work conducted on behalf of over 200,000 clients. They lead a citywide team of 12 senior managers who, in turn, manage the practice's over 1,100 staff. Give it up for Tina. And lastly, but not leastly, Hugh Ryan is a writer, historian, and curator in New York City. With the multi-talented temperament, he is also the host of Queer History 101, the book club and podcast from allstora.com. His most recent book, The Women's House of Detention, A Queer History of a Forgotten Prison, is a queer history of the Women's House of Detention in Greenwich Village. It is the story of one building, people it caged, the neighborhood it changed, and the resistance it inspired. It is the winner of the 2023 Stonewall Book Award / Israel Fishman Award for Nonfiction from the Publishing Triangle of the American Library Association, as well as the 2022 Warren Johansson Award from W.A. Percy Foundation. Give it up for Hugh. I'm ready to hand this mic off to you. Thank you all.
Thank you. This is so exciting. Thank you all for turning out tonight when it is 4,000 degrees and we are all still hungover from Pride. And it means so much. And I want to say a particular thanks to Lena, who's organized all of this, put this together, put in the labor, the thought, everything. This would not be happening tonight without her. So thank you.
Good Bureau.
So thanks everyone for being here. So the Bureau kindly did hosted a book talk for my first book, Manifesting Justice. And there was one person in the audience, and that person is here tonight. Thank you, and thank you to everyone else for coming tonight. And this time I came back with a crew, so we're a force. We're a force here. So we're going to start with each of us just talking a bit about our book or reading an excerpt from the book. And let's see, Tina, do you want to start?
Sure, I'll start. How are you? Good evening, good evening. So first and foremost, full disclosure, I'm not supposed to be here. The person who edited the book is the passion behind the Women in Criminal Justice book, which is right here. It's Women in Criminal Law, a practical guide for inclusive and thriving workplaces. It's Professor Mariam Aranjani. I happened to just be here and was coming to sit in the audience. Unfortunately, Mariam couldn't make it. You have me. So now there's a high bar. Let me just say that. But let me tell you about the book. But more important, how the book came to be. And actually, I truly believe that roads lead. When you're on the right roads in your personal or professional experiences, those roads lead you to connecting to things like tonight. And here's why I say that. So I am the chief public defender at the Legal Aid Society in New York. We're celebrating 150 years. So probably shout out to other defender organizations such as the Bronx Defenders and Brooklyn Defenders. We have a rich, rich history in New York City of labor-driven public defense. And that is how I started my legal career. Now, my legal career started much later in life. I was actually in the 90s doing gang intervention prevention work with the Board of Education, but then went to law school. Well, fast forward, I became the chief attorney at the Legal Aid Society, but how I became involved and met Mariam is actually through my work in the American Bar Association's criminal justice section. And back in 2018, the chair of the section, Professor Lucien Devine, sort of raised the issue and the question of why the practice, the profession, and the ABA were losing droves of women criminal practitioners, not just defense attorneys or public defenders, but state and federal prosecutors and others. And so he commissioned a task force, the Women in Criminal Justice Task Force. And because I was involved as a leader in this section, I was asked to co-chair it with Professor Carla LaRoche. Again, all roads, Alina knows Carla.
Friend of mine.
And when Carla and I met, the American Bar Association has a lot of task force. I mean, many. And sometimes it feels like you analyze a problem, but you never get to a solution. And so the task force just exists to be a task force. And the one thing that Carla and I promised we would do, two things. One, we did not want to do that. If we were going to engage in this process, and that meant for us talking to cis and trans practitioners across the country, if we were going to ask them to share their stories, ask them to share their traumas, ask them to relive the misogyny, the racism, the otherisms that they faced and why they left the profession, well, it was not going to be for naught. So there had to be an outcome. Second thing was, we wanted a task force, not of people who normally belong to the ABA task forces, We wanted people actually who represented the diversity and beauty of the spectrum of women we wanted to speak to. And so, and in order to do this right, the first thing is we needed a really great reporter. And that was Maria Marangiani, who's the author of the book. So the book has articles by commissioners of the task force, but also of people who shared and then wanted to tell that story and put it in writing. And so that by the book. The other thing it did, though, was it forced the ABA to adopt policy. And so Resolution 501 became policy about 4 years after. We were going to do the task force for 1 year. COVID had a different plan for us, so we moved to 2 years. But the ABA, we got the House of Delegates to pass ABA policy on the 10 principles of gender equity in criminal law. What we believe and what we heard from people who testified time and time again were the actual solutions to the things that if we put them in place right now, we would actually have healthier, thriving workplaces. We would hopefully see a change in the way in which the cis and trans women testified, things like, and I'm sure some of you either have experienced this or heard this as an ally. Once I had a child, I felt like I couldn't be a trial litigator. My male partners or the male attorneys in my office get all the trial experience. Now, I'm not just talking about public defenders. We talked to prosecutors, public defenders, state and federal judges. They had their own closed-door session. Intersectionality was really critically important because what you realized was the layering of otherisms just compounded. So if you were a woman, trans woman of color, right? It just got harder and harder for you to practice. So that is how the book was created. It is the culmination of the task force work with the idea that you take that book, you look at the ABA policy now, and if you run an office, on a committee, you can take some of these very important and sometimes easy things to implement and make some real change. So I'll stop there for now, but that's the book.
And we have also shout out to the criminal law professors who are here, because we got a number of them. So this is going to be a valuable book for folks. Women in Criminal Law, a practical guide for inclusive and thriving workplaces through the ABA.
Yes.
And Tina, what I hear you saying is like listening to all of these very personal stories and gathering them and going into spaces of trauma, that you were doing that to be able to change things today and to provide lessons for today. And I think that ties into Hugh's book perfectly, because Hugh Ryan's new book, My Bad, it really, when I read it, I was moved by how incredibly personal it is and how much you do delve into what people might describe as trauma. So could you share with us about your book?
Sure, I swear it's not all trauma.
It's not.
But my book is called My Bad, A Personal History of the Queer 90s and Beyond. I wrote it because I've been a historian now for nearly 20 years, which is shocking. And I realized at some point during that my actual life and experience was moving into history. The original title was actually Becoming History. And it was such a weird process to watch, because so much of what I was seeing in sort of the popular depictions of the queer 90s felt very only tangentially related to what I had actually experienced. And the longer and the further this went on, the more I realized that I was really frustrated. That in fact, the book, which kind of comes out of a starting idea of trying to explain the standpoint from which I do my historical work, to kind of understand for people why it is I have the viewpoint that I have, quickly really moved into trying to analyze how we got here and what it is that we don't see when we see ourselves on the screen in these variations on the 90s. Any of you who were there, I think, probably have had this similar experience. If you turn on a TV show like that show Everything Sucks on Netflix, or that 90's show, or there's a number of others now. It's like all the queer characters, like, first off, they know themselves really well, right? They know exactly who they are. They know what their identity is and means and what the label is for it. And they have like ideas about how to meet other people, which they do very quickly. And they have relationships and they come out to everyone and everyone is fine, except for one person who has like 7 minutes of trouble. And then by the end of the episode is like, now I understand. And I just like, my brain is like screaming bullshit the entire time, you know? And then I was like, well, if I'm not telling this story, then what am I going to expect, right? This is what takes up the space. If the true story isn't told, or the true stories, plural, then these anodyne stories get told instead. And I was starting to meet all of these, particularly undergraduates, 19-year-olds, 20-year-olds, who would tell me, we long for the 90s, you know? And I was like, I think what you long for is a time when you did not have a cell phone surveilling you at all times and pictures of you showing up on the internet every time you turn around. And God knows I long for that too, but I don't think you actually know what that time period was like. And just to give you like one example, as I was writing this, I worked with a couple of different editors because publishing is on fire. And if you try to publish a book now, you will work your way through multiple editors before the book is done. And one of them said to me, really great guy, brilliant, younger, queer person, late 20s, was reading a draft of the book. I was talking about a moment in it where I was talking about the ubiquity of violence in the 90s against queer people, particularly anyone who was very visibly gender nonconforming or engaged in, you know, same-sex PDA, anything like that, that you really could expect violence almost anywhere, anytime. And so he wrote in the notes, he was like, hey, this is really great. So here with you, I know we're a little earlier than this, but I'm wondering if you could talk in this area about Matthew Shepard and the violence against Matthew Shepard, and how like it was such a big deal because no one could imagine someone just being killed for being gay before that. And I was like, what do you think the meaning of Matthew Shepard is? That's not at all. I was like, it was a big deal because people paid attention that he was killed because he was gay, not that he was killed for being gay. That was actually fairly normative. The same editor, in looking at the book, was like talking about a part set in the early 90s where I talked about how there were not queer books for a 12-year-old like me. And in the notes, he was like, it sounds here like you're saying there weren't queer books for people your age, when I think what you're trying to say is they weren't at your library. And I was like, that is in fact not what I am trying to say. You have read this correctly. And more, I was having those experiences. And so what I originally thought was a book for people my age who had been there, who wanted to understand the sort of like POV that I brought to my historical work and how it developed through the 90s, which, if we want to talk about it, like I have a large thesis. We'll have to go back to the 1890s, but I have a very big thesis about the 90s. But in order to understand that, I realized that really what I was trying to do was to help both people my age grapple with the things we still carried with us that we had moved through but perhaps never processed, as in my case, you did mention the trauma, there's a little bit of that, and also younger folks who had never seen the world before it changed because of the internet and a number of other things, to understand what was different. I don't think we can ever turn backwards, that's not how the clock works, but I think we can start to ask ourselves, like, what did we have that we gave up? What did we gain, whether or not we want it? How did we win? Where did we win? What does it mean, for instance, that we have the right to get married and to be in the military, but we still don't have a federal non-discrimination act, right? These are all things that have histories. They have reasons for existing the way they do. And that's what my book became as I wrote it. But unlike my other histories, I was there for it. I didn't feel like I could tell this in the third person, safe as the third person is, much as I love the third person, and much as I did not really actually ever really feel certain that I wanted to tell the stories that were in this book, but without telling them, nothing was going to make sense. And so that's how I came to write My Bad, A Personal History of the Queer 90s and Beyond.
And there are also vignettes about going to Burning Man in the early days, or going
You
to
bring up all the embarrassing things.
It's all there. So there's a lot of stuff in there too. And for me, a lot of going down memory lane and remembering like the full complexity of everything going on in that time period. And in terms of at the time, there weren't books for youth about, or even including queer characters, LGBTQ plus characters, and we're cycling back to that. So born and raised in Indiana, my hometown Fishers is outside of Indianapolis, and a couple of years ago, the public library eliminated all books that were in the youth section that had any LGBTQ plus characters in them. We've seen that happen in libraries across Indiana and across the country. And I wanted to write this book, Pink Crime, to try to connect the dots between abortion against pregnancy criminalization, abortion being illegal, criminal charges brought against parents, and criminalizing queer identity, because they're all of a piece. They're all connected. And when we tie those dots together, when we actually bring all of those stories together, that's when we're able to have a stronger voice. So that you have people who are supportive of reproductive justice, and you're like, oh, actually, I need to be supporting gender-affirming healthcare as well, right? So it connects all of it together for a unified fight, and finding those cases that support that as well. My personal story in bringing it is that I'm a queer woman. I'm married to another woman. We have a daughter, so we're also a queer family, and we moved back to Indiana, my home state, when we were pregnant, and we very much wanted to have a kid, but we also knew that we might need to be able to have abortion healthcare, right? That something could go wrong, and we would need to have access to abortion. You can't in Indiana. So we made a plan for being able to go to Illinois, where you could legally have abortion. Then go to the hospital, and there's documents. Will you sign a document consenting to a drug test? And I was like, oh, sure, I guess, why not? And my wife was like, you are not signing that, no. So I didn't sign it. A couple months later, we get a call from Pregnancy Justice asking if we can find counsel for a family at that same hospital, at that rural hospital in Indiana, where the person giving birth had a difficult birth, had to have a C-section. They gave her painkillers, they gave her morphine. And guess what? Her drug test came back as, oh, she had morphine in her bloodstream. So they took away the child. They called CPS, Child Protective Services, took away the child. They could have called the police at that moment. And she was like, you gave me the drugs. And anyone want to guess what their response was? We don't know that. We don't know that. I mean, sure we did, but you could have come in here and you were already using whatever drug. So we don't know that. So calling CPS. So that's the pregnancy criminalization, and then queer identity being criminalized. So not only is abortion not legal in Indiana, in vast majority of cases, gender affirming care for youth is illegal. The legislature has banned being able to change your gender markers on your birth certificate, on your driver's license. We have bathroom laws. We have laws that attempt to be passed every year to eliminate gay marriage, which I didn't think those laws would go very far, but so it's all of a piece. So that's what led me to write this book. And I wonder if we could each talk about kind of something from the 90s that we think has particular relevance to today, and that we think is, I mean, hopefully something helpful from the book that pulls that out too. And Tina, you want me to give you a minute? And
I think
okay.
give me a minute.
Let's go with you.
Sure. My whole book is about the relevances from the 90s to today, but one big one that is, I think, really essential and that I talk about all the time in my work as a historian is over the last 2 250 years that America has existed, since we're in the centennial year, we might as well use this framework. We've seen major changes in queer identity and queer experience, queer communities, all of these things that we today know and understand, gender, sexuality, gender identity, all of this stuff. But in this last period, this 30-year period since the 90s, we have seen an intensity of change and almost epistemological change, a change in the way of knowing, which for me, I'm a material historian. I think that we change as communities, as people, as individuals, as identities, when the world we live in changes. So in my long work as a historian, the big moment that we hear about a lot in queer history is in the 19th century, you have urbanization in America. And in urbanization, part of what happens is unattached queer people who, to us today, look like gender normative homosexuals, right? We look back in the past and we're like, that is a gender normative homosexual meeting other gender normative homosexuals along the waterfront or in their jobs as maids or in all these other sex segregated spaces in the 1800s in cities where they're pushed together and all the men are living together and all the women are living together. And suddenly sexologists and journalists and the courts and everyone notices these people and defines them, right? We get homosexuality is born in the late 1800s as an identity and as an idea because of urbanization. Urbanization changes how we live, so it changes how we understand ourselves, right? This is an established idea in the field of queer studies. In the 1990s, another change comes about. The internet, cellular technology, all of this immediately changes how we live in every way possible. For instance, here's a really quick one. This is one that came up with a lot of my friends when I was writing the book. So many friends, including one of my partners, who spent their childhoods saying to their mother, I'm a woman, I'm a girl, mama, I'm a girl, can I be a girl? And being told when they finally were like 16 and snuck out of their homes and made it to a gay bar, that meant they were gay, right? And you look at Gay New York, the Ur text of what it meant to be gay in the 90s, the Ur gay history text, it will tell you that in the 1800s, men took women's names, wore women's clothes, wore makeup, and referred to each other as she and her to mark their entry into the homosexual underground, right? Because that's what it means to be gay. And in the 90s, if you watched popular films like To Wong Fu, Thanks for Everything, Julie Newmar, right? The movie tells you it's about a bunch of drag queens. It, in fact, in the beginning, explains the differences between transsexuals, transvestites, and drag queens. Yet in the film itself, the three lead characters never take off the drag. And at the very end, when someone says to Patrick Swayze's character, I love you, Miss Vita Boheme, she says, I've waited my whole life to hear someone say those words to that name, right? So what we're dealing with here are experiences that to us today sound like trans experiences. And those young people, like my partner, who in the 80s said, I'm a girl, I'm a girl, I'm a girl, and then was finally told at 17, 16 that meant he was homosexual. Well, those kids, they're not waiting to go to a gay bar. They are going on the internet and they're typing in, I am a girl, right? And the answer they're getting is not, you're a homosexual. The answer that we're seeing is a much more set of complicated from inside the community understandings. These things that we today call identity, whether that's non-binary, whether that's trans, whether that's pan, whether that's two-spirit, all of these ways that we inside the community have defined to understand our experiences. Now, because of the internet, young folks like my partner are being introduced to them and not being told, you have to narrow yourself down to this singular category that is about your sexuality and is completely divorced from gender. And trans people are this one thing over there that like most people aren't, right? And we can see this in the numbers. If you look at the statistics, Gen Z and Gen Alpha are our queerest generations to date, ever, by far. And so much of their identification is with those identities that were not granted space in the 20th century, right? Broadly bisexual and trans identities. And to me, that is a direct result of the changes brought about in the 90s because of the way we live, because of the way information is structured. We change as community and as people when the world changes. And the 90s, I think we will soon look back on as a hinge decade when everything changed for us, but also for the world. So that's one of those places where I really think we have to be looking back to the 90s and even further back, of course, to the 1890s, right? Because this is an ongoing history. There is no start or end point. Gay rights did not begin in 1969 with Stonewall, but they didn't begin in the 1890s with urbanization either. This is an endless sort of desire the body, gender, all of this stuff exists above and beyond us, but we interpret it differently based on how and where and when we live. And so for me, the 90s are one of those essential moments in that flow of history.
I've been on my soapbox about this for 10 years, so it's a great release to get to write it out to the world.
Yeah, that's great. Pick up the book. So the 90s for my book are really an example of queer criminalization that we're seeing today as well. And one example is it was the tail end of the Satanic Panic. So it was this mass hysteria that led to real criminal charges against daycare providers for sexually abusing toddlers, young children. And prosecutors would bring hundreds of charges of sexual violence against these children. And we see police coercion leading to false accusations, we see faulty forensic evidence, and we see gender and sexual orientation bias. Like we see those playing roles together in these charges that were predominantly against gay men, queer women, and straight women. And why did the Satanic Panic happen? It happened because it was right after the 1970s, 1980s, where women were entering the workforce. So we needed daycares for the first time. Okay, so that was one reason to demonize daycares. So also, there was more actually recognition of queer people, rights for queer people. It was going up to the Supreme Court. There was more visibility. There was pride. So it was this real conservative backlash against both of those things happening, leading to this very real criminalization. And one example is the San Antonio Four, which is 4 women who, Julia knows, that in San Antonio, 3 of them are Latinas, it's 4 women, they're all lesbians, and they're charged with sexual violence against these 2 young girls. And once those girls are adults, one of them says, that was a coerced statement that I made. And it was my father who coerced me into saying this. And once she admitted that and said that publicly and said that in the records, he tried to take her children away from her. So he was continuing to be coercive towards her. But it was those statements, and it was fantastical statements of violence against these girls, fantastical. And yet it was rooted as reality because these women were lesbians. That because you have consensual relationships with adults who are of the same gender, that equates to this long stereotype of sexual violence and sexual violence towards children. And it took over a decade for those women's wrongful convictions to be reversed. They have been reversed, but we see the same thing happening today. So even though we see Jeffrey Epstein in the news repeatedly, still, instead we have this slur that queer people, trans people are violent, sexually violent, and sexually violent against youth. Instead, we have our first transgender, openly transgender legislator in Congress who is immediately labeled as a groomer by other legislators, right? By other people in positions of power and authority. So we're seeing this happening again right now. So that's how I think those can be connected. We may think, oh, that was in the 90s, but it's happening again today.
I think coming out of the 2 things you're talking about, the thing that sort of resonates with me, 2 things that I think, one, less in the book, but I think we have to name, because when you talk about anybody who's doing work in the legal system, you have to think about policing. And right now, certainly in New York City, thinking about policing in the 90s and sort of this idea that somehow we have gotten better with policing. We're right back to broken windows. We're right back to arresting people for taking 2 seats on a subway. And when you think about what motivates practitioners, particularly sort of law students, to think they want to start to get into the fight, right? To sort of stand up. Whether you believe that because you join a prosecutor's office, because you believe that you can have that discretion, or you become a public defender, or you make the move to the bench, thinking that So I do think you have to name that. And I think that we are certainly seeing is sort of this rolling back to a time that many of us thought, oh, the days of squeegees and arresting people for squeegeeing windshields in New York City are long over. No. So that's my personal one. But as to the book, I think clearly what we heard, whether it was in Seattle, Spokane, San Diego, here in New York, San Antonio, everywhere we listened, and no matter who came before us as a task force to give testimony, those who had been doing this for decades said nothing has changed, right? Nothing has changed. I've gotten older, so I've built a way of handling it, but the things, and many of the people who came, the women who came to testify, they didn't testify and leave, they stayed. It wound up becoming a conversation and a listening session as much as it was testimony. And they would say things like, I just heard something that I said 25 years ago, and that shit hasn't changed, right? So I think what you will see in the book, when you read it, is that all of the authors are telling their own story. And they cross the spectrum of age. We made sure that we had a law student as a commissioner on the task force, to somebody who's a federal judge, to somebody who's a private practitioner doing it for 40 years, to somebody who was in the first couple of years of practice, right? They were all saying the same thing over and over again. And I think that what was interesting, and I tell this from my personal, so this is my personal story around this. So the first thing I had to really reflect on, and I think when you think about identity, when you think about the things we're talking about, when you're thinking about how you continually come out in life, not one time, it's not I come out one time, I don't know, I've come out 15 times, and every time, right, the language changes. The identity, the naming of who I am changes. I was a lesbian. I would not use that term to describe me today, right? We heard a lot of that. And as we would hear it, we would go back and we would debrief the listening session. So your point about trauma, it really resonated with me. We'd go to dinner and we'd all debrief. And the trauma for the members of the task force who had just spent hours listening to stories and testimony was real. I mean, it hit hard. A lot of times it was too hard to even debrief and we had to give it a break. And over the first couple of times, I started to realize that there's something wrong with me. I'm not feeling that. It hits hard. But I'm not feeling, I don't think I'm feeling what my friends are feeling here. And then I realized, right, because from the moment I came to become a public defender, I had a masculine identity. I was masculine. And then you realize, oh, it's misogyny. I never had the experience where the judge asked me, I wasn't going to wear a skirt. And he was never asking me to wear a skirt. Why? Because he saw me and thinks, oh, that court officers never gave me a hard time. I always got my cases. My clients never gave me. People were like, but I would hear, and then you realize it was misogyny. And relates to your 90s. We had someone testify that they were a district attorney and they transitioned in that role. And her experience after her transition was completely 100% different than it was when she first worked there before her transition. misogyny, right? So when you talk about the 90s, I don't think you have to talk about misogyny, right? But it's so subliminal sometimes that you don't even name it until you realize how you unpack your trauma. So.
And
Want to jump on public disorder law?
yeah, do it.
What you said about the public disorder laws at the beginning there, for those of you who don't know this, public disorder laws are some of the worst, most controlling, most awful laws, and they're directly connected to queer history. The first law in New York City specifically against gay people, is a 1927 law called the Shackno Bill. What it did was it took the public disorderly conduct statute and broke it into 10 different subsections, one of which was about men soliciting other men for sex. So the first laws that are used to specifically criminalize in New York City homosexuality are public disorder laws. But beyond that, the laws that were used when I wrote the Women's House of Detention, the laws that were used to arrest the vast majority of queer women in New York City history were also public disorder laws, because it was defined in New York State case law that prostitution had nothing to do with the exchange of sex for money. Prostitution was the common lewdness of woman, because the law understood that any poor woman was an invitation to prostitution. And so any woman who was out on the street alone, at night, in pants, in these ways, they represented themselves as basically a walking piece of disorder. Our first laws against any kind of cross-dressing, the historian Jules Gill Peterson is doing a fantastic series on this right now. Highly recommend signing up for her newsletter. But these first laws about cross-dressing were actually part of sumptuary laws, which were all about how you could dress in public because of your class station. They were not laws against trans identity, they were laws against disruption. And all of our identities in this vast sort of queer umbrella, however we define ourselves and identify, we are criminalized first as sites of disorder for everyone else, that we cause problems by existing in visible ways. And since the Tunnel Roxy Danceterias are represented here, these are the same laws that eventually get used by Giuliani, these broken windows laws, to shut down the nightclubs. All of these dance laws that revert back to the 1940s that are all about public disorder. Right? So we can think that public disorder has nothing to do with queer identity, and that it's also a very minor charge, but in fact, it is kind of the insidious heart of going after almost everyone who is considered to be wrong in the public sphere, going back hundreds of years.
Well, and there's a number of misdemeanors today that, for example, if you don't have an ID that matches your gender expression, right? And yet if you're in a state that doesn't allow you to change your gender markers on your card, or you're going to vote. And someone's bringing this up to me today. You're going to vote, you show your ID, and the gender marker on your ID does not match your gender expression, your gender performance. And is that going to be alleged to be voter fraud? So all these ways that it seems, it's low level, but it is about controlling bodily autonomy, about controlling expression, gender expression, and it's going on today as well. And I wonder at this moment if we should turn to questions from the audience, because I saw someone had their hands up.
Well, first, I just wanted to say, Giuliani started that, but Christine Quinn, a lesbian, and city council actually is the one who shut them down, and we were all looking at the 2000s. And that was disappointing, right? Because we all wanted her to be mayor, and then she's going after the gays, and what's going on? But I just wanted to say, I agree with you that misogyny hasn't changed, and we can definitely see that at very high levels. The fact that the way Hillary Clinton was treated versus Marco Rubio, who's breaking all kinds of laws, but no one seems to care. But I just wanted to say things have changed. I mean, I grew up in the 90s in the Deep South, and the first lesbian adult or gay adult I ever met was actually a police officer. And I know we like to vilify police officers, but it was very, very difficult to be an openly gay, lesbian, queer, trans law enforcement person. And that is not the case before. And I've actually had this real struggle in my mind about that, because it's really popular now to say, we don't want the cops at Pride, all this stuff. And I'm like, there are lots of gay cops. I want them to feel comfortable also at Pride. But I just want to say, she ran for sheriff in South Georgia. Obviously, the good old boys were not going to let this butch type be sheriff. But I was so impressed that she did it, and it was so empowering for me as a, now I would say queer kid in the 90s, then I would say gay kid. And things have changed, that it's easier to be a gay cop. And I do think that does help. I mean, 2003, it was still illegal for me to have gay sex until Lawrence v. Texas. People forget that, right? I try to remind people, like, every time I had sex in the 90s, I was breaking the law. And I just felt like a criminal. My entire life growing up, I think most of it probably felt that way. I was a criminal. And I know Hugh writes about that in his book. Like, we were just all criminals. And that's just the way I was. And so it's really hard now in 2026 to remind myself I'm not a criminal, because that was just our blueprint, was that just being gay was illegal and just having gay sex was illegal. And so that has changed. And I think that's good.
Yeah, the book has lots of examples of, I think, sort of thinking about that sheriff, right? Of the way in which you begin to make it better is you have to push the limits. You need people, however, to feel safe and supported by allies to push those limits. So there's a chapter in the book during the task force, 4 members took on elevating, either joining the bench for the first time or going for a position higher up. And it was as a result of the bravery that they were witnessing from people who were testifying. So it became a support system, right, for these women, Latina, Black women, who didn't think they had an option or a support system, and then realized what they were hearing and thought, I need to do this, not just for me, but somebody needs to push this limit, right? One of them became the chief judge for a state. So you're right. I think you have those examples of people who are like, well, enough is enough. I mean, Stonewall, right? Enough is enough. It's a brick, right? It's a brick. It's protesting, or it's moving legislation inside the houses of government, right? But again, you've got to have the allies there to say, you're not alone. And I think what we learned from the listening sessions and the work was, and what we heard back was, we feel heard. We don't feel alone. And I bet you we can talk for hours about movements that began because people didn't feel alone. You and I were talking about this space. I mean, this space, this building, for many of us, right, when we were coming out, was the place to go to just be here, right, to feel supported, or conversations like tonight.
Well, and I would say, there are police today, trans police, who don't necessarily feel safe. My wife, Jennifer Oliva, she writes and does research on prescription drug monitoring databases, where testosterone is one of those drugs that's monitored as a prescription that you receive, and police can access those databases. And when we were living in West Virginia, she had a trans police officer who reached out to her and said, I'm worried because the officers I work with can look this up and can see that I'm getting testosterone and can out me. So I think we need the support, we need the allies, because there still can be that danger. And in terms of being criminalized, we have someone right here who advocated for folks to be taken off of the sex offender registry, because you'd be on the registry for those offenses for years after Lawrence versus Texas. So absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, everything both of you said, and I think things do change and other things stay exactly the same. And the one thing I would add to the conversation is that Stephen Thrasher wrote this incredible book, The Overseer Class, which just came out a couple of months ago. And one of the things he really talks about in there is, to use the example of that cop, no idea, know nothing about her, but she would have both been an inspiration for you and the person who was in charge of criminalizing those other people at that time. And right, what has changed? One of the things the Overseer Class really questions is, like, when you move into a position like cop, how do you use that power, right? And he's really looking at the ways in which members of marginalized classes of all kinds often can get a foothold in things like the military or policing, but that foothold rests on your ability to enact violent power over other people in your own group. And so when we talk about things changing, I often want to think like there is change and there is progress, and those are not always the same thing, even though they can look like the same thing from outside. And so, yeah, Stephen Thrasher, really brilliant book, Overseer Class, highly recommend.
Hugh, will you talk about your episode where you had interaction with the criminal justice system with the serial killer?
Innocent no me? Yeah, so this is one of the harder parts of the book, to be honest. And if anyone, for whatever reason, does not want to hear about a lot of violence for a few minutes, like, please feel free to check yourself out, walk out of the room. I don't care. You cannot hurt my feelings. Take care of yourself. But when I was a young person, I've done it very differently. I was really not sure about the line between what it meant to be gay or to be trans. I was very femme presenting in the 90s in a world where I was told over and over again, there were only two jobs in that case. It was sex worker or drag queen, and I cannot lip sync. And so that was the only option, particularly when my folks threatened to stop paying my tuition, and all of these other things were sort of falling apart in my life. And I ended up doing sex work, off the internet, which was so easy because since I was 13, men were offering me money for sex on the internet. America Online, everybody knows it, was a giant gay sex portal. And some of those men were great, some of those men were wonderful, some of those men were crazy, some of those men were evil, and one was a murderer who dismembered a 12-year-old after he raped him a month after he picked me up off the street. And so I ended up being called by the cops who were trying to investigate this crime. I was working as I had a summer job working with the Progressive Party down in Maryland. My job was to stand on the street corner with a roll of quarters and try to convince people to use a payphone to call the city council and tell them to vote yes on a living wage bill. So this is what I did all summer long. I stood out on the street with a roll of quarters trying to get people to be angry on the phone. But I didn't have a phone myself. I had no cell phone. My job paid so little, I was sleeping on people's couches. So when the police called, they called me at my work, because that was the only place they could reach me, where we had a terrible conversation where even in this moment where they were trying to do the right thing, they were not trying to arrest me. They were still cruel, cold, mean, just awful. I cried hysterically in my boss's office and then had to fix myself up and go back to work. They were not helpful. That just point blank. I mean, they did eventually arrest this guy, and he is still in jail, which is fantastic. Yet they treated those of us in the case you would think of as the survivors, the victims, as shit. And so I think I have a specific take on the cops. Thanks to that. And from that, I went on to end up working on rape crisis hotlines as a way to deal, because there was no one to talk to about that kind of sexual violence, right? There was no one I was going to tell this about. And I was definitely not going to tell anyone I was working as a sex worker, or that the police had called me looking for this guy who I had met voluntarily, right? And nothing had happened between us bad. I was terrified of him. I knew from the moment I met him that something was very wrong with this man. And yet my interaction with him was completely innocuous, basically, and so in order to process that, I ended up working on a rape crisis hotline for the next year and a half, which was in many ways kind of what I needed. But the whole incident is one that I really have never talked about since, because at the time there was just nowhere to talk about. We didn't even have the word sex worker then. I mean, I'm sure some people did. I didn't. It was whore or red boy or slut or just young gay person, because everyone I knew was making these choices. So that's another way in which I think things have certainly changed since the 90s, right? We have ways to talk about these things. We have groups, we have organizations. I was the first guy to ever volunteer on the rape crisis hotline where I worked, right? Things have changed. Also, that hotline is gone now. In fact, all the hotlines that I used to work with and on, this was a network of hotlines, have all gone under since. So they've changed in some ways and they've disappeared in others. This is another one of the things my book really deals with at length, is that in the 90s, we had both assimilation and acknowledgement and tolerance come in, right? I think part of that's the long tail of AIDS, part of that is the work of many, many activists over many, many years, and part of that is the work of people just coming out everywhere all the time, changing the world. But those private worlds that we created prior to that, these rape crisis hotlines, these gay bars, these neighborhoods, these collectives, these communal homes, these organizations like the Kabahi River Collective, right? All of these groups that required us putting our energy into each other and into our private spaces necessarily were starved when we gained acceptance, right? Because now we can go everywhere, supposedly. We can go lots of places some of the time, right? There's a gay bar, not near, but there is a gay night sometimes, right? We have a little bit of the public. And in order to get that, we had to trade a lot of the private. And that is one of the things that I think we are still sort of trying to wrestle with. How much did we give away? Did we give away too much? Did we like what we got in return for what we gave? How many people come to this center as a social space? Right, when I moved back here in 2001, the first thing I did was come here and start volunteering for the Valentine's Day dance to do graphic design, because that is where people came. This was a place full of cultural events. This was a center, right? And now it's mostly a social service center aside from the Bureau. And I'm not saying that's a good or a bad thing. I'm just saying it's what happened. And now we have to ask ourselves, like, do we like it? Is this where we wanted to end up?
Duran.
Hi, so this was fascinating and wonderful, and so I'm also a law professor, but I don't do criminal law. But I want to say that there's a big audience. I do employment law and I do healthcare, and I think there's a big audience for your book and your work in the employment law world as well. So I just wanted to say that, and I'm very interested in it, and even not criminal law, and I plan to. But my question kind of comes, it's a really, I think, natural segment from what you just said. I'm a gay dad raising my child in Chelsea. And I really am very interested, and I write a little bit about gay parenthood and queer parenthood. And I think that's kind of like what you're talking about, what we gave in, or what we're taking in, or what we're accepted on, is I think really has a lot to do with parenthood. And I just wanted to ask you your, view on gay and queer parenthood, and how did that? I'm sure it changed a lot in the 90s, right? But maybe it's criminalized in certain ways. My work that is empirical shows that people are really not loving this idea about sexualization of parents, stuff like that. And I was just, I kind of wanted to leave it open-ended somewhat for you to talk about.
I'll start out on this. Thanks, Duran. So I think this really ties into the queer erasure that we're seeing, and the affirmative queer erasure that's happening. So in my home state of Indiana, for the month of June, Pride Month, June 1st, our governor proclaimed the month to be Nuclear Family Month. And Nuclear Family Month, an explicit proclamation by the state of Indiana, you can look it up. Nuclear family is a man married to a woman with biological children. That's what a family is. That's the only framework for a family. And then our lieutenant governor posted that with a sign that said, "Take back the rainbow." So they're not even trying to say this is another vision of a family. They're like, no, this is the only vision of a family. And that's the erasure that I try to push back against in my book. And we're just seeing that more and more. And I wonder, in the criminal legal system, there's always this question of, for clients, are queer clients being erased? Are they losing their identity? Are they not able to express themselves? Do they have an attorney who is saying, no, I don't want to hear that? Lambda Legal did a great study just a couple years ago. And I'm blanking on the name of it.
But it's Richard Sainz.
Yes, Rudolph Sainz. Exactly.
Yep, there you go.
Yes.
Can you say that again?
Protected and served.
Yes, protected and served. Exactly. About queer and people living with HIV, their experience with prisons and with police and with criminal legal system. And you have people who say, oh, my defender said, I don't want to hear about your identity. I don't want to hear that. Not going to bring that up. On the other hand, you have people who say, I don't want my identity to be in the criminal courtroom. I don't want prosecutors who are exploiting me and exploiting my identity to try to turn a jury to say, oh yes, they're guilty because of their identity. So there's a lot going on there. I know I've strayed from the the queer family, but into queer erasure. But I don't know. Do you
Yeah,
have?
I mean,
thoughts on that?
and my colleague in the back can talk about this too. I mean, it's interesting to be a public defender in New York because first and foremost, you know, there's a belief system that, by the way, as a public defender, in particular city, you don't have racism, you don't have bias, you're not heterocentric, right? Okay, that's all bullshit, right? We walk around with the same bias every single day, and sometimes it's gonna surface. It does surface implicitly in the way in which you advise your clients, or explicitly. And then there's an issue at Legal Aid Society, and I'm very proud. She couldn't make it tonight. Why? Because she's home with our kids. But my wife, Kim Forte, launched the LGBT law policy unit at Legal Aid Society. And the reason why she was doing it, she was a juvenile rights attorney. She was tired of sort of pushing our own colleagues to recognize their bias and to check it and to start talking to the people we represented and asking the questions that some lawyers are still today petrified to ask. And so all the assumptions you build into interviewing and building a relationship with your client. So she launched that because whether we like it or not, we were terrified of talking about sexual orientation, gender identity, and expression with our clients, right? Petrified. Now, if it's a criminal defense attorney, you've got to meet your client. I met hundreds of clients, before I went into management, but hundreds of clients, to which when I saw the rap sheet, it said male, Black, NYSID number, their arrest number, and then their charges. And you launch into these litanies of asking lots of questions and making assumptions based on the rap sheet, the criminal history, which, by the way, is fueled by the policing system, right? That designation of male, Black is because some police officer at some point in this person's first arrest decided that's what they saw. And then the entire case and your entire interview of your client is based on that, without saying, is this right? Right? Now, we've gotten better at it, but that still exists. And I will tell you, there were many times where my client recognized that the person walking into interviewing them was queer. So there was a sort of and they would be like, just get me out of here. Don't raise a word. It says John, use John. It's not John, but here's my name. But just get me out of here, because the fear is the system will continue to beat me down, right? We're having a conversation right now with the Office of Court Administration, where they want to instruct the judges to be more inclusive. And we're saying that's great, but you can't have the person who sits up high with the robe, with all the power, just be like, so what pronoun would you like me to use? We're like, that's not a safe space, right? The intention is the right one, right? You have to say, like, okay, our court is trying to recognize the history, trying to change, trying to progress. But it's power. And when you hold power, whether it's sheriff power, elected power, the power of even being the person who has to talk for your client, that's my job, right? You have to speak. Your client is told, remain silent, it's your right. And this lawyer is going to speak for you. That's the power I hold. So I hear you. I think but that also exists in so much of any work we do, whether that's public defense or across the spectrum. I think also, particularly as we're thinking about community engagement with that piece.
Yeah, no, I think power and the queer family actually go right hand in hand for me in a lot of ways, because what I think about a lot is that, you know, to have a family in this country and to be recognized for it and not arrested, depends on a bit of normativity, right? That there is a certain degree to which I have two partners who've been together for 16 years. We own our own home communally with a group of other queer folks and immigrants. We would never be allowed to adopt, right? And it's not about can we support a child? It's not about do we love a child? It's about how well do we fit a mold for what we are told is the right way to do this. And yet only by going into that mold can we then push against it and expand it, right? I think so much of this world rests on this idea that like marriage law makes any sense whatsoever. It doesn't. What does our government have any interest in our sex lives, right? They have an interest in knowing that we are cared for. Care is the root of something the government cares about, because if you are uncared for, you end up on the streets, you end up in prison, you end up in asylums and emergency rooms, and in all these ways, you become a cost for the state. So marriage law is our like very clumsy way of going through a religious institution, a cultural institution, to get at something that the state actually cares about. Marriage law is where so much family law gets built off of, right? And who can adopt, and who has the rights to a child, and who has the right to parental support, and who is the right kind of parent. So as people enter into this, right, as queer couples of all kinds, they're somewhat pushing against the law. They're trying to expand it, the box they're stuffed in. They're also stuffing themselves into the box in order to fit. I have so many friends who've adopted who like de-queer the house right before the social worker comes over, right? All of these ways in which normativity and power are just part of the same structures that are acceptance, tolerance, and the expansion of rights. There's no easy answer. It's always this kind of like contestation. And so when we say things like, oh, it's so much easier to be a queer family today, it's like for certain kinds of people, right? And that's always the way. That's just how it is. And so when I think about family, I think about both this like idealize what should our government care about, right? And also what does our government care about? And where do we as queer people sort of like have to navigate those two things to make more space for the people who come after us than there was for us, but also to fit into the space that exists for us so that we can have the lives we want to have. I don't, like you were saying, I hold nothing against anyone who says, refer to me by John, that will get me out of here. That is who I need to be in this moment, right? We need to be the person we need to be to have the life we want to have. And then I think we also need to consider like who is coming behind us and what kind of space do we wish we had that we can try to make for them as we push our way through this process.
So going back to what you were saying about how public we are now, given the conditional level of safety we acquired, how much we traded, with marriage to gay rights, how much we traded by giving away that privacy, while we have a level of being safer. We've also lost a lot of the cultural space and a lot of within the hotlines used to exist. A lot of they don't exist now because they don't have to. I'm just thinking about people, including myself, who don't remember that time, who only remember a world where we were progressively, we were gaining rights, we were on the upswing, where we are now, where more or less a lot of people, they're trying to bring us back to that. I don't know, that people are, they're saying they're nostalgic for it, but the fear is that we're going back to that place that you all were describing, but right now where we are, because we're starting from a place, well, a lot of us, we're starting from a place of remembering when it was better, not great, but better, where we're going to end up. Like, if we do, like, let's say we lose a lot of the games we acquired, we end up, like, if we were back in that space that we were in the 90s without that cultural space, without the safety and privacy we were in. I'm just like thinking, how are we going to, a lot of young people, especially younger than me, I'm only 33, they just don't have those skills to navigate. I didn't have a lot of those skills I wish we did to navigate, community and those resources and build all that almost from the ground up, because so many of us just were working with this assumption that they would keep getting better. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean it's a real question, right? And I think this is part of that answer. I think this space is part of that answer, right? The creation of the Bureau was a response to there not being a bookstore in Manhattan. And yeah, the hotlines don't exist, but everyone's in 30 group chats, some of which are queer and political. I think we have to find ways to move forward rather than thinking about how we can go back. The one thing that I try to say all the time, and this goes right back to what I was saying, that we have sort of seen this before. If we can imagine that urbanization changed the way we understood ourselves, made queer people visible in new ways, there was a huge anti-urban backlash. In America, it's called the eugenics movement, right? It's anti-immigrant, just like it is now. It's anti-urban spaces, just like it is now. It's anti-queer, it's pro-misogyny, it's, you know, it's all of the same things that are happening to us right now. Then it was a response to urbanization. Now it's a response to what is happening on the internet. And what I will say is that those people are idiots. Like, I know that we're supposed to like respect everyone, but like actually the people who are against us are really stupid in really profound and essential ways. And I think it is not wrong or bad. I think it is necessary to remember that they in fact have no idea what they're fighting against, that they do not understand that the changes they are fighting are not pediatric gender medicine. They're the ways in which we know ourselves and interact with one another. And unless they literally want to take us back to the 80s, unless they want to destroy every cell phone, shut down every website, which they're trying. I mean, right? COSA and all of these safety acts are really trying to shut down our ways of communicating. They will never be effective. It took World War II to slam the door shut on these older ways of knowing that we had before urbanization in America, to at least out loud say eugenics are wrong, that this kind of like hatred that has its epitome in Nazi Germany, but was here at the same time under many different names. It took that war to bring us to a moment where the older way of knowing died. It never died, right? It never dies. There's always the thread continues, the thread inflames, but we had this revolution in how we think, organize, and understand ourselves. And the good and bad part, I think, is that we are in the middle of that right now, right? Like, we are in the moment where we actually don't know how to move forward, but we know the old world can no longer exist. It is falling apart around us. It sucks to live in that time. Like, everyone I've spoken to who has any connection to the 30s, every record I've read of people in Weimar, Berlin, right? They have the same experience. Like, it was amazing, and then it fell apart. And we don't quite know why. But I think part of the reason it's falling apart so hard right now is the young people who've never known the world before, right? It is Gen Z and Gen Alpha and the younger millennials who have never known how awful it once was, who refuse to accept how awful it is now, and who are asking the question, like, how do we move forward? And those are the people who are going to have the answers, because it's never going to work to just say, like, we're going to open up a gay center just like we did in the 70s and everyone's going to come to it, because it's not going to happen, right? It's not how we live. We've got to find new ways forward. And that, I think, is what we are engaged, the messiness right now, which can feel so fractious, where we're not sure what words to use, and we're afraid we're going to, like, offend each other, and that is actually us as a community figuring out how to come together and how to create space and how to, like, move these questions. But it's hard, and it's going to be full of losses. And I think there is no other way to understand this moment except as, like, the last moment before this kind of epistemological clash resolves itself.
But you really explain well in your book that the 90s did suck. That's part of the point. I mean, we had New Cambridge, we had Stromberg. We're happy that Lindsey Graham and Mitchell Howell are dying because we lived through that. I mean, it was terrible.
Yeah,
it was fun, but it was terrible.
Yeah, and it had all of these other ways of knowing. Like, we had this balance that has now been upset by the new way, right? And that we'll never go back to that. But we will have something new in the future. And I think the questions you are asking are the essential ones. And it's like, how do we do this together? How do we make spaces that feel vital and supportive and, like, actually have the things we need? I have been so excited, not just by the Bureau, but anybody been to Gladys, the new Black lesbian bookstore in Bed-Stuy, right? We are getting these spaces back. Hive Mind in Bed-Stuy, right? We are seeing these places reappear. Bars are reappearing. Community centers are starting to do more programming like this. And it will be different, I hope, but it will be. And I don't think the answer is to ask, like, those of us who were there before. We have some ideas, right? Like, I can tell you how to facilitate a 12-hour anarchist meeting where no one has a phone, but I don't think most people are going to sit through that. But it's useful to know. It's a useful skill. I'm not sad that I have that skill. But I do think we're experiencing this moment because the people who never experienced the world before are growing up and saying, like, I am not going to fit in that box. I am not going to let go of my transition. I am not going to let you call me whatever name you want to call me. I am not going to respect these laws that make no sense to me. I am not going to not say gay. I am not going to not talk about Palestine. Like this is the movement, and we are seeing it. That's a reason they crack down on the college kids, right? Because they are the ones who are changing things. Sorry, I got on my soapbox about that.
Yeah.
Well, I'll go ahead and add something, which is, it was surprising to me to learn this, but I'm at Indiana University, and for orientation for the 18-year-olds who are coming to college, they have a orientation class on how to talk to people, how to introduce yourself, how to engage with people face to face. And that sounds so basic, and yet, like, it's a point about, okay, this is something that needs to happen to have the building blocks to be able to communicate when we are, in person, face to face in a different way. Because one thing I've been hearing is that as there's more and more surveillance, and as there's more and more, police being able to whatever data company is just going to turn over all your information, right? And turn over your private conversations. And the more that happens, the more there's going to potentially be a growth in in-person dialogues, in private spaces, in community spaces. Who knows? But I think there will be ways of, okay, how do we outmaneuver what's happening? How do we harness our own power to be able to get around what's happening? Yeah.
I wonder if all three of you, it's really not a question, but an invitation for you to reflect on something that I think is important to acknowledge. You and Belina, I think for the two of you as teachers, how do you see yourself as how do you see your role as providing hope to students in this moment? And like, what is, I guess, Tina, frankly, you were a possibility model for me, right? Like I have known you since I was a law student. Right. And I know that, like, there are certain things about being masked in the criminal legal system that, allows us to move through that space with privilege, but there are also challenges there, right? And I always saw you as somebody who was like such a badass lawyer doing this work, right? And doing it as somebody who looked like me. Right, and I wonder if you could reflect on that a little bit, and what are all of your roles, right, as queer people existing, just in that way, just existing, right? And I know this is like so related to your book, right? All three of you. I'd love to hear some flash from that.
Wow, thank you. I do all the folks who are on my team think I'm crazy. So we're a pretty large practice, right? And all told, we have like 1,100 staff people, and every year we hire law grads to come do the work. And since I became the deputy and now the chief, I do all the second round interviews. And are you out of your mind? I was like, first of all, it saves my sanity to meet people who want to come to this work. Also, though, because they are educating me every step of the way, because they really do want different things than you're just talking. Like, I'm going to be at Legal Aid Society in September, 24 years. Like, the lifetime or legal aid lawyers are probably a sort of, I'm going to use the term dying breed. I don't mean that literally, at least I hope not for me, but right? Like, folks come to becoming public defenders and know that they're only going to stay a few years, make a tremendous impact, and then move on. But the reason why I do it too is because many times I'm meeting a queer new law grad who is like, I don't think I'm going to ever be able to litigate. I don't understand how to do that. Now, I will say that, again, I get to say, particularly if they're mass identifying, you got this. I tried every single case. I promise you I didn't wear pearls. I promise you I didn't wear a skirt. In fact, if I did, I would have lost the trial because I would have felt so uncomfortable in my own skin that a jury would see right through that. Your job is to convince that jury that your client, right, is innocent. Like, that's a high bar, I know that. We say, yeah, it's the burden of the prosecutor, but really what you're trying to prove is you have more credibility than the prosecutor, and in order to do that, you have to be comfortable in your skin every single time you walk into that room. And if you're not, by the way, heard this from women we spoke to who are prosecutors who are like, I don't want to wear the dress. I don't want to wear the pearls, but I was told I had to from my male supervisor, right? Okay. What we have not seen yet, and if you see it, I want to know about it. We haven't really seen a trans woman attorney walk into a litigation space and feel that acceptance. Now, the person who testified that they did not, by the way, after their transition, they had to go into the appellate bureau because they stopped getting assigned the homicide cases, right? So I'm waiting for that. And we need some role models because I'm not going to be that, right? I can't be that. That's not my identity. But we haven't seen that yet. And again, I think that's reflective of a real question as to why. But I do think paving the way and hope right now, trying to talk to folks about how you get up the next day and go into a courtroom after, by the way, the TPS was taken away from your like there are people, there are public defenders, there are prosecutors, and there are judges who every day have to deal with really heavy things, but in their personal life, they have a friend who was just taken by ICE. The TPS was removed from the government. We had somebody who's heard that their health records were going to be subpoenaed for their hormone treatment. So every day folks are walking into those courtrooms to do that, and yet we have to find the hook, and I'm sure it's like that in law schools too.
Well, thank you. There are clients in the criminal courtroom, and I brought up the San Antonio 4, Anna Vasquez, I'll bring her up, that when she went to trial, her attorney was like, no, you can't appear gay. You have to perform your gender a certain way. You have to wear a dress. You have to curl your hair. And she says, I felt so fake. Like, that wasn't me. And she says she thinks that's part of the reason she was wrongly convicted was because the jury did not think that she was authentic, right? And if she didn't seem trustworthy about her own identity, then could she be trustworthy in saying, I didn't commit this crime? So I carry that in my own work in the sense of being authentic for my students, being openly queer in the classroom, talking about my wife, having pictures of our family in my office, in part because, so I'm in rural Indiana, I have a number of very conservative students, and actually, so Deb has been doing some research on this. And Deb Lowey, she's starting LGBTQ plus defense clinic at Fordham. So, but there's research that if you're exposed to images, visuals that are incongruent for you, like a woman who is a construction worker who's breastfeeding, like if you see that image, you might be like, what? That throws me off, all those things together. But the more you see that, the more you're just like, oh yeah, what? They're breastfeeding. Who cares? And they're a construction worker. Sure. So if there is that dissonance for any of my students, I hope that by seeing queer families in my office, in my space, by having a professor who's standing up in front of the classroom and is saying, yes, my wife, that all of that helps. And I'll give one example, which again is, I'm sure, very Indiana and very rural, but my wife is a veteran. And so we often joke about when we meet veterans or when I'll meet a veteran, I'll be like, oh, my wife is a veteran. Because going back to the 90s and Hugh's book, a number of those older veterans were there in the time of Don't Ask, Don't Tell. My wife served under Don't Ask, Don't Tell. And so like, no, of course we didn't have any big people, right? And so that's another, hopefully, a dissonance thing. But again, conservative state.
It's funny, I think the biggest thing that I think about with all my students, I'm a writing teacher. I have no background in history. No one will ever hire me to teach history. It's very unfortunate. I can write all the books in the world and I will never get a job. But I do get to teach writing, which I love and is one of like my most favorite things to do in the world. I love being in the workshop. I love working with writers. And one of the things I really try to model for all of my students, and especially my queer students, is like, I fuck up regularly. Like I didn't publish my first book till I was 39. I have made so many mistakes. I have like ruined so many friendships. I have like done so many things wrong. And so many of my students live in a world that is simultaneously so precarious that it feels like there are so few routes towards like a solid adulthood where you can pay your bills and be happy. That combined with the surveillance of social media makes them feel like any amount of doing or saying the wrong thing is going to have them like permanently like kept out of the good life. And there is a degree to which that is true now, right? Like it is precarious. We are surveilled at all times. And yet that very fear often keeps them from expressing themselves in the ways on the page that allow them to say something new or something familiar in a new way. And when they cannot do that, when they are so afraid of saying something different, whether it's good or bad, they can't say anything at all. We end up with these writers. I work with them all the time. They can write a beautiful sentence, but they cannot say anything. And that is a fear that when I was younger, we were afraid we were going to get like killed or kicked out of the house. It was a different set of fears, but it made us more feral in some ways. You either like were totally in the closet and did not recognize that part of yourself at all publicly, or you were like, I'm just going to burn the world down because there's no other option. And the young people today, again, it's that half-hearted toleration that we get, right? They are trying to figure out how do they squish themselves into this tiny space, both in ways trying to adapt to public life and appear straighter, but also in ways where they might have a political idea that they think they're going to get in trouble for, or they're going to tell a story about their childhood and worry that everyone's going to interpret it the wrong way, and then it's going to be all over social media, and then tomorrow they're going to be the laughing stock of the world, they'll be the main character, right? And I get that fear, but one of the things I really work with them on is like, how do we push past this, and where do we get to the ideas that are your ideas? It's one thing to say, I've learned all of this, I feel differently, so I'm going to say different things because I have changed. And another thing to say, I've heard all this stuff, now I'm worried my ideas are wrong, so I'm going to try to hide them. And that, I think, is the biggest place where I work with young people today, particularly queer young people, is like, let's get into your specificness. Let's get into your weirdness. Let's get into what you believe, what you feel, what you think. I don't have to agree. No one else has to agree. And yeah, there are going to be people who are going to say shit, right? Like that is going to happen. But otherwise, like, what are you here for? If you're in a writing program and you're not going to be able to say your stuff, like you're never going to get the career you want because you're going to spend your life not saying the things you need to say. And so that is what I work on with like all of my students, but particularly my queer students who I think have been told so often before they even get to me that like their way of being or thinking or expressing themselves is wrong, that they are often really like closed down and really trying to work out, like even, my program is one-on-one. We exchange work back and forth over the course of months. It's not a classroom program. Even with me, I can feel them trying to like bend their ideas to what they think I want. I'm trying to say to them, like, what I want is for you to be the most you and not the most me. And that, I think, is something we need to tell all queer young people.
Y'all have been great.
Yeah.
So many questions on the 90 degree day.
If people just have a few wrap-up words that they want to share, but on my end, thank you for coming. Thank you for caring about the criminalization that's happening right now and what we can do about that, and paying attention to and trying to stop these laws. And voting for who our electeds are, who our elected prosecutors are. I mean, it's the electeds who are deciding who they're going to prosecute, what laws they're going to prosecute. Same with police chiefs who are setting who are they going to try to target, who are they going to try to, I mean, it's one lever that we have. So thanks for folks for paying attention to that.
Yeah, the only thing I'll say is read. Reading is going down in the whole world, and like when we do read, it's on a screen while we're paying half attention, or we're listening to an audiobook at 1.5 speed while doing the dishes. And so many of the books in this room are meant to be engaged with deeply by someone who has put their soul into them. And we are losing that time. And I think for most of us, we are losing it by accident. We want to read, we want this to be part of our life, but like and even I as a writer have to like take that time and say like, I am turning off all the devices. I'm going to sit with just the book and I'm going to think about what's here. And I think without that kind of transmission of ideas and of self, I mean, the novel is a beautiful thing because it lets us get into someone else's head in a way no other piece of art allows, right? It allows for empathy and sympathy and pathos and bathos and so much more. And yet, if we do not read these books, it does not matter what anyone writes at all. So please take the time, whether it's high art, low art, whether it's romantasy or the encyclopedia, just find time in your life to read.
I think the lesson is from the book, certainly, and from the process we went through, and I think even the experience we just had tonight. Being in community and having conversation and listening. I fear a little bit because I have 11-year-olds. Their heads are in the phones right now. I fear we lose the connection. But I think there's moments, even with my 11-year-olds, where they want to share something with me, and I'm thinking in my head, I don't have any interest whatsoever in this thing that you are talking about. Some video, YouTube, and I have to remind myself, the first thing you would tell anybody that worked for you or a young public defender that you were is you have to listen. And talk less. So listen.
Thank you, everyone. And we're here to sign books. If you've got one.
Thank you all. I do want to
It's nice to actually meet in person.
And you know, even in your talk, you said it's the younger generation, those younger.
Well, that's good to hear.
Because there are so many at my age, we're the only ones that are age.
Yeah. So
You
we're
turn 15.
just for like.
We're in it.
And I played the
But I mean, how come you say
Thank you so much.
Yeah, exactly.
I feel really
and
good.
you talk is both, I've seen you talk before too, so.
So,
No, you stayed the whole time. I did. It was a good room, good questions. Always makes a difference. Thank you. Yeah, I know of my first book I read by her. Well, but unintentional. One of my.
I think I still have,
I was gonna say, I can sell that on. So
I believe that. I'm starting to believe it. I wrote for like it's the way we need to. go wrong. They are the land.
So,
I've seen that, and like, so, you know, people, remember, it doesn't. Yeah, I think my problem is that I'm being constant, and actually, yeah, I know. You know, yeah, you need to do this one. Training like, I work with basketball, it's not very helpful. So, you know, I think St. Thomas. And I'm just so wait, I want to leave. I want to put that in another one. I want to learn, you know, well, it's very, very nice to meet you. And thank you for your work. Really fascinating. We'll read it. And we'll like. I'll tell you what. You know, like I would write a novel there. So you're gonna be the next one. I had a very mind book when I was probably upset. Like, that's the thing I'm doing. Yes, that's right. I read three. Oh, exactly. And I'm like, exactly. And I'm like, you said, and I check how long we after, and I'm like, I think we another more, you know, yeah. Just the way like you operate for.
Yeah, and then you're right.
Yeah.
It was great to be here. Bob is a big component of the work putting into our substitution. I feel.
You're like,
Rather than right.
oh,
Yeah, right. I remember.